Hi, I'm Mike from Craft Supplies USA, and today we've got a fun Halloween-inspired project to go along with our other blockhead video. We've got some fun Halloween-themed decals to take your blockheads to the next level for the spooky season. We have a full in-depth video on turning just the regular blockheads with the interchangeable hats. We'll link to that in the description, but we have some really fun examples of things you can do here, like we have our pumpkin, we've got our witch, we've got Frankenstein, and then we have the ghost, and then on this side we've got a skeleton head. In this video, we'll be turning the witch, but let's just go over some of these other ones we have here. So for the pumpkin, I've got my carving tool, and I carved a bunch of grooves in there to give it that pumpkin shape. And plus, I went a little bit bigger on the diameter. And you can change that and do some different decorative techniques to make your pumpkin look a certain way. And then on our Frankenstein, it was just turning a regular blockhead, but for his hair, I turned the hair as one piece, and then I went to a sander to get that texture to give him that really cool look for his hair. And then this one is just a regular blockhead, just painted white with the double decals on there. For the witch, it's turning just a regular blockhead, but then we'll show you how to turn the hat as well. This one was burned to give it a really cool texture to make it look kind of like a felt hat, but it gives it that weathered texture, and then we turned a little decorative band on there. So let's go to the lathe and we'll show you how to turn these. Alright, for our blockhead, we're going to need a block that's 3 by 3 by roughly 4 to 5 inches long. I want something that's dry as well, so I'm going to be using this piece of dried maple, and it's going to give me a little bit extra material we can save for a tenon or a jam chuck later on. But I've got my centers marked, so we're going to go ahead and mount this right between centers. And you can see I've got my drive center mounted in my chuck jaws. That's going to be nice because then I can just remove that center directly from the chuck. I don't have to, go ahead and then thread my chuck on later. It'll save you a little bit of time. But what we're looking to do is just get this to round, get a tenon on it so we can flip it around, because we will be drilling a hole in this in the bottom for rechucking purposes, as well as just to lighten it up. We've got our tool rest set. It's center working height, and then we need to make sure that the blank clears our tool rest as well. If I need to, I can push that tailstock just a little bit further away to give me the clearance I need. To rough our blank down to round, we'll be using a spindle roughing gouge, and I want my tool rest and my cutting edge at center working height, so that looks like it's a touch high. So I'll bring that down just a little bit, and then we can snug up our tailstock. I don't want a lot of pressure from the tailstock, just enough to keep the blank supported while we're turning. And then this is a safety drive on this side, so it's that multi-pronged center, not a 4-prong. So I might need to tighten it up as we're turning, as those teeth bite into the end of the wood. So let's turn this on, and I like to start with that speed at 0 and then bring it up to speed. That way, if the piece isn't mounted securely, you can catch it before it's going too fast. So we're at about 1500 RPM. I've got my flute about 1 o'clock position, and then we're going to just start working this down. Spindle roughing gouge makes quick work of this. It's slipping just a little bit, so I'm going to snug that up. We're getting a pretty big gap between our tool rest and our workpiece, so we just want to bring that in, make sure our tool is fully supported. Now that we've got those corners off, we can bump that speed up a little bit faster, about 1800 RPM. Now we'll use our skew to throw a tenon on this end of the blank. I'm just going to scoot that over. We'll use a peel cut, so I've got that handle nice and low. We'll engage the bevel first, and then we'll lift the handle. And that's going to fit our chuck jaws. We're using the 2.5-inch dovetail jaws. We'll use the skew to do a little bit of a slice cut here on the end. I'm going to throw just a small chamfer on here. That's going to help us start that cut a little bit easier. That slice cut's going to give us really clean end grain fiber right there. And then we'll just throw a small chamfer on this end as well. But if we stop the lathe and take a look, you can see those end grain fibers are cut nice and clean. So that's what we're looking for. But now we can take this out of our centers and we'll throw that directly into our chuck. Reason we want to be in the chuck is because we will be drilling out the bottom of our blank. So we want to have that be able to be supported with our chuck on this end so we can drill this out. And you can still see we still have some flat spots. I didn't want to go fully to round because this blank is pretty close to our finish size once it's round. And if it's not perfectly centered, I want to make sure I have enough material to true up as well. So we'll get this mounted into our chuck here. Clamp that down nice and snug. Okay, that's still running pretty true. Now we can use our spindle roughing gouge just to get this to round. We'll bring up that tailstock for a little extra support. Okay, now we're nice and round. We can clean up the end here with our skew, get this surface trued up, and then we'll clean it up with a slice. Throw a small chamfer on this side with the skew. That should give us a nice clean surface with that skew. So there's no tear out. There's a little bit of over burnish there just from rubbing the bevel a little too hard, but it's nice and clean cut. So remove our tailstock for just a second. Clean up our nub that we have here on the end. Tool rest is just a touch high. Bring that down. We'll use our spindle gouge now just to clean up that nub and get the surface prepped for drilling. So we'll drop our speed down nice and low, about 500 RPM for our Forstner bit. Alright, so I've got my keyless chuck with an 1.5" bit. You can use whatever size bit you want to. 1.5's a good size to remove material to keep this thing lighter, and then it'll give us enough room to get our pin jaws in there to expand into that opening. Again, I like to keep the tailstock loose, allow that bit to find its natural center point, and then lock this down, and then we can start drilling. Sounds like my bit's just a touch dull. But now we can throw that lower step onto the bottom here. That's going to be 2 7/16 diameter by just under 1/4 inch long. So we'll use our skew to cut that. Again, we'll go to a peel cut here. Got just a little bit left of a little fuzz. Get my skew back in here. There we go. I'm going to go just a little bit further. Okay, once we have our step cut, I like to concave the bottom here just slightly, so I'll go to my spindle gouge. Make sure my flute's totally closed. And then we'll finish that cut right there just on the nose of the tool. And it'll peel those unsupported fibers right there. It'll curl those over just a bit, but we can clean that up and throw just a small chamfer on the inside edge. Once we've got our step established, now we can get our half round here on the bottom. This 1/2-inch spindle gouge is just a little bit big for this size of bead. That's looking pretty good. If you need to, you can go to your skew just to refine that curve if you need to, just to smooth it out and just get that right contour you're looking for. But it's clean cut. We've got that nice half round there. We've got this undercut here on the foot, and then we have a nice little chamfer on the inside edge. So now if we want to, we can just clean up this surface just a bit more before we sand this bottom half, because once we flip it around, we're going to be really close to our chuck jaws and we won't be able to access this anymore. So I want to make sure this surface is nice and clean. Alright, so I'm going to drop my speed down. And this surface is pretty clean, so I think I'm actually going to start with 240. And just lightly sand here. We don't have to remove a ton of material. I'm pretty happy with the shape we've already got off the tool. So now we're just looking to get rid of any tool marks and just blend that radius together. Give it a nice smooth contour. Got a little bit of a deep tool mark. Just going to bring my skew back in just to smooth that out. Now we can go to our 320. Alright, now that we have this surface sanded, we can apply some sanding sealer directly to our piece. This is going to help that spray paint. It's basically going to be like a primer for the spray paint, because that end grain fibers, when you spray directly onto wood, it doesn't absorb super great into the wood fibers, and some areas absorb more than others. So I'm looking to just give this a nice uniform base for that spray paint to adhere to. So I'm just getting the areas that we won't be able to access later on. So just the underside of the foot here, the bottom half of this bead, and then just part way up the body of our blockhead. So just get a nice even coat on there. Once it's applied, nice thing about the sanding sealer is then you just kind of buff dry it. Plus it'll be curing as we're doing the rest of our turning process. But we'll just do some friction on here just to get that cured as fast as we can. The other thing too with these rags, it is a flammable liquid, so we want to make sure we lay these out outside, let those things dry off, that way we don't have to risk a shop fire. Alright, so the overall height on our body is going to be 3 1/4 inches. So I want to make sure that I give ourselves roughly 1/8 of an inch or more as a little bit of extra material for the parting, any tear out from our parting tool. So I'm going to go basically just an 1/8 inch past our 3 1/4 mark for our overall height. So we'll part the blank off at this height. We can save this scrap piece here as a jam chuck or something for something later on. So once you have that marked, we can grab our parting tool and then cut this off, and we'll remount this on our pin jaws. If you don't have pin jaws, you can turn this down to be as a jam chuck to fit into our drill hole. So if you don't have those pin jaws, just take note of that and keep that block in your chuck. When you're using the parting tool, you need to make sure you basically cut twice as wide as your blade is. That way you have enough room for shavings to clear out and it won't bind on your tool. And this is a ways over the rest for this nano parting tool. So I want to take fairly light cuts. And then once we're getting close, I'm going to use my support hand to catch the piece as it comes off. And if you don't want to do that, you can use a handsaw, turn the lathe off, and just saw off your piece. But we have the bottom half of our blockhead done, so we'll set that off to the side. And we'll take this chuck off the lathe. We'll be using a VM100 with the extended pin jaws. This is one of my favorite sets of jaws for the 100 chucks. I use these all the time for spindle projects and things. So we'll close these pretty much all the way down, and then we can just slip that over and seat that against those jaws. Alright, so now that we have this flipped around in our chuck, I'm going to set my calipers for the diameter of our top. Turn this on nice and slow and we'll just get our mark. Then we can use our skew to peel cut that. We'll clean up our end grain fibers here. And I've got my flute about 3 o'clock position. My rest is just a tad high. And we're looking for just a nice straight across flat surface on the very top. We'll use the nose of the tool to cut off our nub there, and that surface should be clean cut and it's nice and flat. So I'm happy with this. We just need to clean up our step there and then get this body nice and flat across. So I'll go back to my skew. Just clean up this surface. And then we can bring this around. We're going to get this nice and straight across, so we'll use the spindle roughing gouge. And if you need to, you can use your ruler to make sure that it's nice and straight. Get a straight edge of some sort just to make sure that surface is nice and flat all the way across. Go to our spindle gouge now and get this radius. Okay, that curve's starting to look good. Now let's just refine it. You can pick up the cut midway through the bead. Okay, I think that looks pretty good. Should be clean cut as well. Nice, that looks really good. We've got a really good surface, and now we're ready to sand this. We can sand that nice and flat as well. If you have any tool marks or anything, we can get rid of those. And it looks like there's some figure in this piece too, which unfortunately, spray paint's gonna cover that, but if you wanted to, you could leave it natural as well. So let's go ahead and start sanding, and then we're gonna be ready to paint this piece as well. Again, we drop that speed back down to about 600 or so for our sanding, maybe just a little bit quicker. And again, these edges are kind of sharp right there, so be careful of those. Those will cut you up pretty quick. If you wanted to, you could put just a small little, just touch them with the sandpaper just to soften that edge so it's not so sharp. Now we'll go to our 320. The nice thing is when you have a really clean cut surface off the tool, you don't have to spend a lot of time sanding. So the better and more proficient you get with your tools, the less time you have to spend in the sanding dust. We'll get our rag for our sanding sealer. Sanding sealer again is just going to give us a nice base for our spray paint. And if you're not going to spray paint it, it gives you a really good sealed surface for whatever your final finish is going to be. It's going to enhance the grain, give it a really good chatoyancy to it if it's got any figure, and it's going to leave it nice and natural colored as well. Once you get it coated, grab a clean side of the cloth and we'll just bump up our speed and then buff dry this piece. Set this rag off to the side so it can dry. Just grab a new piece of clean cloth just to friction dry this. Okay, so this piece is ready to spray paint. If you want to leave it natural, you can. Otherwise, you can paint it. And for our witch, I've got the paint here that I'll be using. This is just Rust-Oleum. This is their key lime color. It's a gloss. I think it's a really good color with the decals. I think it looks pretty good for the witch. So I'll take this outside. Once your sanding sealer is cured and everything, then you can go ahead and spray paint it. So I'll take this outside. We'll paint it. And in the meantime, as that's drying, we can start turning the hat. Alright, so while we wait for the main body to dry, we're going to start turning the hat. For my material here, this was just a piece out of our fire pile, a little bit of a burl piece, and it's not cut very round, so it's going to be off center. But I've got my center points marked, and then I've got this dimple in here for my tailstock. So this is going to be the top of the hat. This was just the biggest piece I had available. We've got some defects and some knots and burl inclusions, so we do want to take our time and wash the material as we're turning it and make sure it's not going to come off the lathe on us. But let's go ahead and get this mounted between centers here. Okay, I'm going to snug that down nice and tight. And then we want to make sure that our tool rest clears. And because this is a burl piece, I've got grain swirling all over the place, so I'll be using a bowl gouge to rough this and not my spindle roughing gouge to start. But we want to get this to round and then clean this up and be able to put a tenon on it for our chuck so we can flip it around and have this be the bottom of our hat. So we'll start with our lathe speed down nice and low. And we'll bring this up to speed. And we'll be using a 3/8 bowl gouge just to get this to round. And as I'm turning this, you can see I'm standing off to the side quite a ways. I don't want any of the bark to come off on and hit me in the face, and I don't want this, if it does come out of the chuck, I'm out of the line of fire. So that's why I'm standing off to the side. Stop the lathe and we can bring our rest up just a little closer. You can see we're getting a lot closer to round. We just have some flat spots here. We still have a fair amount of dirt and bark on this end, so I want to be careful with that. I'm going to bring my tool rest around so I can work on the end here. Start truing up this burl surface. We'll flip it over and come from this direction now. And I need to get just a little bit closer with my tool rest, so I'm going to bring this back and then tighten that up again. Just getting rid of some of that bulk of that material. I'm actually going to switch to my spindle gouge now to cut my tenon. And now that we're running true, we can bump that up to speed. It's not perfectly trued up yet, but it's good enough so we can bump the speed. We'll come in from this side and make sure this is slightly undercut to give us a good surface to register against our chuck jaws. And then we need to shorten up the back end of this tenon here. I'm going to throw a small chamfer on that just in case. All right. So now that we have this material, our tenon cut, we can mount this in our chuck. And you can see I've got a small little bump right there so we can grab our skew and just kind of chisel that off. That way it fits into our chuck better. So let's grab our chuck key and we'll take our center out. Now we've got a nice secure mounting hold here. We just need to clean up and true up the bottom of this hat. And then we'll use a Forstner bit to drill the recess that'll match the little tenon we have on our head here. So let's get this surface cleaned up. And we have a really deep bark inclusion here. I might actually try and incorporate that. That way the hat has kind of a cutout. Makes it look like a really worn witch's hat. So I'll bring my tool rest around. That way we can true up this surface. And the reason we want to true this up before we drill is if that surface is crooked at all, that Forstner bit's going to hit on one side and it's going to start kicking it around and it's not going to drill straight. So we want to make sure that this surface is nice and flat. That way it engages the entirety of this Forstner bit all at one time. Slightly chamfer that corner. So now let's get rid of our revolving center. We can grab our Forstner bit and drill into it. Alright, so I've got a 1 7/8 bit and the hat diameter is right at about 2 inches. We'll open this up to fit our head once we're done with the Forstner bit, but this is going to be used to get the bulk of the material out of our way, and then we can use that skew just to open it up 1/8 of an inch or so. So let's turn our speed down for drilling, about 500 RPM. And then I like to advance that until it starts. That's not running very true, actually. I'm going to use my spindle gouge just to clean up that hole. Again, I like to keep that tailstock loose until it engages, and then we can lock it down. And I'm going to drill that about 3/8 of an inch deep. I know this is just under 1/4 of an inch tall, and I will be undercutting the hat. That way the hat sits kind of down on the head a little bit. So that's why I drilled that 3/8 deep. That way I can undercut this and still have the right depth that I need. So now we can get rid of our Forstner bit. We'll bring our tailstock back further so we have room for our handle. And to open this up, we can just use our skew, basically using this negative rake box scraper, and we can go in there and just open up this slightly. We can check the fit on this guy because this was turned to the same diameter. That's perfect. So that's one way you can do it. If you don't have the exact size bit as the head is that you've turned, you can go a little bit smaller and then open it up with your skew. So let's finish undercutting this and giving that a little bit of a shape to it. And then I raise the handle right there at the opening and try and use the nose of that tool to get in there to slice those fibers. You can chamfer that just so we have a nice clean cut there. That undercut's pretty good. I think I might go just a little bit more. This is going to be a concave surface. Pick up the cut here. And swing my handle away. And go a little bit more. Perfect. And to get that undercut that I wanted, that tenon, or sorry, that recess is just a little bit shallow. So I'm just going to deepen that a hair. So I'll get my Forstner bit back in and just drill out another 1/16 or 1/8 of an inch just to get the depth that I need. And then we'll use that skew to open up that little step. Perfect. Okay, now that we're going to be flipping this around, I want to make sure that this is sanded, because we won't have room to access that once it's flipped around. So let's grab our sandpaper back out. And actually, before we sand it, I'm going to shear scrape the underside of this rim here just to clean it up. So I'm going to drop my tool rest just a little bit. And to shear scrape, we'll use that bowl gouge. And I've got the handle nice and low, and I've rolled that flute over. We're cutting on the bottom of the wing right here. We're just going to refine the surface. You can see how much better that surface looks already. Now we're ready for our paper. And on the hat, I'm not going to put sanding sealer on it because I'm not entirely sure what I want to do just yet. I might use a torch to burn it to give it a really cool, unique look and texture to it. We might leave it natural. I'm not entirely sure what I want to do just yet. I want to see what the top of the hat's going to look like once it's remounted and turned to shape. So I'll just sand the surface that way. If we do want to put a finish on it or spray lacquer it or use a spray paint, we can do that as well. But I just want to make sure that surface is prepped. So we'll take this out of our chuck, and we're going to switch the jaws or the chuck out here because these 2.5 inch dovetail jaws are going to be a little bit too big for that opening we've cut. We can go back to our pin jaws, or if you have shark jaws, the smaller size, those will also work really well. but we're going to want to use our tailstock for support. Because this isn't going to be engaging on the tenon, it's going to be engaging on the flat as well. There's nothing really keeping it on the jaws. So we're going to want that tailstock support as much as possible. And we'll also want the right size chuck key for the chuck. So let's get this opened up into our turned recess. And then we can bring up our revolving center to give us that support we need for the turning process as we get all this material out of the way. I'm going to just make sure my jaws are nice and tight because we have plenty of material. I can snug those down quite a ways. But I think this will be a really cool piece of material for the hat. We've got a lot of burl swirls and everything, some spalting going through there. We got this big inclusion I think we're going to leave in there because it'll add some character to the hat as well. So let's get our tool rest in position to where we can start making that tapered shape for the hat. Now let's get turning. All right, I want to bring down the overall diameter of this piece by about 3/8 to 1/2 inch. I'm going to bump up my turning speed. Slow down right here on the very end and just let the nose of the tool cut through. Stop and eyeball that diameter. I think that's going to be pretty close to what we want for our final hat diameter. So now let's start working this down and getting that shape we need. My gouge is getting pretty dull. I'm going to go sharpen it real quick. Alright, so I just sharpened my gouge. And I'm starting here with that flute about 3 o'clock in this direction. Once I'm on bevel, I open that up just a little bit. And we're just trying to get material out of our way. That flute position really isn't changing that much on this curve. It's pretty much all tool handle angle. I'm swinging that handle this direction to change where that bevel's pointed as we're making our cut. I don't want to get too skinny here on the end because that tailstock, with that being a 60-degree cone, will probably split the material if we go to our final diameter right now. So I want to keep this fairly thick right here just so we have the support we need for the turning process right now. I'm going to switch to my spindle gouge just so I can get some more detail down there in the bottom of the pointy part where it meets the brim. So I'm just cutting some detail into the brim here. I want to have like a little decorative bead band right here. That way it kind of Gives it a little nicer look. We'll put a little V-groove in right there. We'll thin that down just a hair. I think that diameter is actually pretty good there. And as far as the shape of the hat goes, you can see I'm kind of alternating the bevel direction to give it kind of a wavy profile to it. I don't want it to be just a uniform curve all the way down to the point. So I'm just kind of changing my bevel angle as I go across the surface. And that's going to give it that wavy texture. Make it look more like a kind of a used hat a little bit. Something kind of crumpled a little bit. But that burl's looking really good. We still have a little bit of that inclusion I think we'll keep in there. I think the shape and diameter is actually looking pretty good. At first I was going to part this section off because it looked a little tall, but I think I'm going to actually incorporate as much of that as I can into the length of the hat because the brim is so large. Just shear scraping that brim. It's getting fairly thin, so we're getting a lot of chatter. Come back in with my spindle gouge and give ourselves that little detail groove we had. Alright, let's use our spindle gouge now to get this center point down to where we want it. I'm going to get rid of my tailstock just a little bit. At least lighten up the pressure. It's still engaged, but it's just very, very light pressure. If you have your tailstock cranked down with a ton of pressure, as you get to the end of that nubbin, it's getting thinner and thinner. It'll split that material. So you want to make sure you lighten up the tailstock pressure. Now we can bring that back out of our way. We'll just use the spindle gouge just to round over the point. Okay. That burl's looking really cool actually. I'm going to use my spindle gouge. There was just a little bit of uncut fiber right here. So I'm going to bring my spindle gouge back in. Alright, so we've left this unsanded. I'm going to take this outside and use a torch just to slightly discolor some areas, make it look like it got hit by a spell or something, and just make it look a little more worn in. So we'll go outside with a blowtorch and do that. I obviously don't want to do it in your shop because that's a big fire risk. So I'll take this outside, torch it, we'll come back in and we'll talk about what we did and see how it looks. If we don't like it, we can always sand away a lot of it and refine the surface and then put a finish on it if we want to. But let's see what the torch does. So I'll take this outside and we'll be right back. Alright, so we've just come back from torching this. We've given it a really good weathered, distorted, or aged look to it. I think it makes that maple burl looking really nice for a witch's hat. For the final finish, I'll be using the scratch-free on top. It's just going to refine that surface just a little bit because of the grit inside, but it's going to give it a good oil wax kind of finish on there. It's going to darken it up and give it a good patina for our hat. Bring that speed down though, nice and low. The hat distorted just a little bit from the heat, so I don't want to turn that at full speed. But that's giving it a really good look to it. I think once we get this all put together with the witch body and the decals on there, I think this hat's going to look really, really good. But you can see how it's darkened those colors, enhanced them, made the grain pop really nice. We got that nice maple burl and a little bit of spalting through there. Plus we have that nice charred look from our torch. So I think for a witch's hat, that's really good looking. I think that's exactly what we were shooting for. So we're just waiting for the body, the spray paint on the body to finish drying. So we'll set this off to the side. And once that's dry, we'll come back, throw the decals on and show you how this looks. All right, so we're back in the studio. We've let the paint dry for 24 hours, so we're ready to apply our decal. And we've got our hat completed. I think that turned out really cool. But it's time to apply our decal, and this one we'll be using the Witch. All the decals have transfer tape on there, so it'll keep your decal lined up and square and everything when you go to put this on. So first thing we need to do is just peel this off, the backer. We can set that off to the side, and then I like to just lay this down, and then usually what I do is I'll just eyeball and center this, make sure it's as level as I can get it. I think that looks pretty good. And as we're applying this, we like to rub those decals down so that way they make sure they stick. Get any air bubbles out if you have any. And then we can peel off our transfer tape. If the decal starts to lift with it, just make sure you rub that down a little bit on the corner. And then we can peel that off. Once the transfer tape's off, just give that a quick little rub down. Make sure any of those fine corners or the details are nice and stuck down. But I think that looks pretty good. So let's set that down. We can put our hat on. And that's going to be our completed witch. So hopefully you guys have learned some new tips and techniques about turning the blockheads. If you haven't seen our other video, it's in the description. Go ahead and watch that. And if you have any questions or comments, leave them in the comments section down below. And as always, subscribe to our channel for more wood turning videos.